Okay, so period, semicolons, comma, fanboys, and colons all create what I'm going to call end punctuation. We talked about semicolons and colons. A colon is used to set off a list as a point of emphasis or as a direct quote. I'm not too worried about you remembering those three things. It's not going to matter that much. There's an actually more specific rule that we'll use. Okay? And so down in this chart, these 1 and 2 and 2a are all going to fill out this chart for us. When I have complete sentence and complete sentence, what goes in the box? And we've already talked about this a little bit. A period, semicolon, comma, fanboys. And so if you don't remember what comma fanboys means, you learned this when you were a little kid probably. That's an acronym that stands for a set of coordinating conjunctions. And those conjunctions are and, and, F-A-N, nor, be, but, or, yet, and so. And any of those words can be used in between two complete sentences. The kicker is you've got to have a comma before it. So comma, and then any of these words can go between two complete sentences. And then the last thing, and the reason that this isn't broken, it's on purpose, it's not an accident, is because this is where our colon is going to go. Right, the big thing here is when we use a colon, so all of these three things are the exact same thing. They're completely interchangeable. Sorry, that's kind of sloppy. They're completely interchangeable. Not one of these is not going to be any more correct or any less wrong than any of the other three. A colon can be substituted in here, always, but sometimes we're going to use a colon a little bit differently, and it doesn't fit with two complete pieces because one part would be incomplete. That's confusing. We'll show some examples and then we'll make it cleaner. What I mean by this is a colon. So I have a complete sentence. I always have to have a complete sentence first. In this box is where the colon would go. Okay, and then what follows doesn't matter. It might be a list or a point of emphasis or a direct quote, and that doesn't really matter. So I'm going to put those three things in here. List, point of emphasis is just like an example, where 3 is a quote. Okay, sometimes this is a complete sentence, sometimes it's not. And it doesn't matter, and that's why there's no line here, because it is definitely complete, then your colon, and then this piece doesn't matter. Sometimes it might be incomplete, which is why there's no line, and it fits into this side as well. Okay? A big thing with the colon is that you have to have a complete sentence, and then the colon, and then it doesn't matter what comes after. It might be a complete piece, which is completely fine, and it might be an incomplete piece, which is also completely fine. One other thing to note, a colon equals a single dash. Looks something like that. Okay, one single dash can also equal a colon. Okay, the incomplete side. Right now, like this is where all of the comma rules come into play. We're going to talk about those rules with number 8 later. But right now, we're just going to talk about basically non-essential clauses. How can I create a non-essential clause? Most of the time, so I can use one comma, and we'll talk about those rules later. Or how do I create a non-essential clause? Right? It's with that set of commas that we talked about earlier. Okay, how else can I create it? I can use long dashes. That will create a non-essential clause. Or I can use parentheses. Right? And then that would also create a non-essential clause. The big thing here is that I can't mix my pieces. So if I use a comma in the front side, I can't use a dash in the back side. They have to match. Most of the time, you're going to see non-essential clauses done with commas, and that's what we've seen so far. Every once in a while, you'll see two dashes. This is different than a single dash. A single dash means a colon. Two dashes is going to create the non-essential clause. And then I don't know that I've ever seen this, but it could happen with parentheses being used to create the non-essential clause as well. On the ACT, I don't know that I've ever seen it. I've seen it in real life, but not on the ACT. All right, so that's how I'm creating those non-essential clauses. Okay, remember our steps with non-essential clauses. We bracket the clause if we think it is a non-essential clause. We read around it, and then if it makes sense, and we are given the option, we're going to delete the non-essential clause. Okay, here's a good example. You cannot use a single comma to separate two sentences unless you also use a coordinating conjunction. What that's saying is comma fanboys. Here's an example. I'm going to apply to 4 colleges, and I hope they all accept me. I see a comma and a fanboy. Is this a complete thought? Subject, I am going is my verb phrase. Does it, so my test is this. Complete sentence. What do I need? Subject, verb, and then the other part that we often forget is the complete thought. It has to be a complete thought. Subject, verb, is it a complete thought? Does it make sense if somebody just said it and walked away? I am going to apply to 4 colleges. Yes. Second part, I hope, subject, verb, I hope they all accept me. Yeah, it makes sense. I'm using a pronoun. They is the colleges. I hope those colleges all accept me. That makes sense. I'm good on both ends. So I have complete, box complete. What could go in this box? Period, semicolon, comma fanboys, or technically I could use a colon as well. It'd be kind of a weird place to use it, but it could happen. All right, and so that's what I'm looking at with this complete, incomplete side. I'm trying to figure out if I have 2 complete pieces. If I do, my punctuation has to come from the side of the chart. If I don't, it's going to be a comma or some sort of non-essential clause set up in a different way. Some practice. I'm going to do 1 or 2 of these with you, and then I'm going to give you 5 minutes or so to answer the rest of them. Okay, so here's how I do this. The first thing that you're going to notice in the passage, this would be the passage, and then you've got 4 answer choices. There will never be a directive with grammar questions. I shouldn't say never. 95% of the time, you're not going to see a directive with a grammar question. So I have my 4 answer choices. The first thing I'm doing is looking through these choices. Do I see end punctuation? Remember, end punctuation is anything off the left side of your chart. So a period, a semicolon, comma fanboys, or a colon. A is just a comma. B is just a comma. And then R, which is not a fanboys. C is a period, and D is a period. So here, after not is my end punctuation. So I'm drawing a little barrier line. I'm going to read both pieces. Those artists who look good on camera have a greater chance of success than those who do not. That's definitely a complete thought. The second part, examples are not difficult to find. Both of these are, they say examples are not difficult to find. Subject examples, what do we know about them? They are not difficult to find. I've got 2 complete sentences. What can go in this box? Hopefully you're saying period, semicolon, comma fanboys, or maybe a colon. The only answer choices that do that are C and D, right? What's different between these 2? Imagine if this was a semicolon and this was a period. The ACT would not make you pick between a semicolon and a period because they do the exact same thing. They're completely interchangeable parts. Right? So if this was a period and this was a semicolon or vice versa, that wouldn't be what the question was asking anymore. It would be asking what else is changing in this question. And you'll notice that C has a comma here. Examples are not difficult to find, or examples are not difficult to find. Do I need to pause? The answer is no, I don't. And here's the rule. Never put a comma between subject and verb unless there are two. Never put a single comma between subject and verb unless there are two. What does that last part mean, unless there are two? Put two commas there? Well, yeah, this would create a non-essential clause where the subject would be here and the verb would be here, and this would split it, probably, with commas, but it could also be like dashes. I just put my comma on the wrong page, sure did. Okay, and so that's what I'm looking to do. That's the rule I'm looking to enforce here. I can never put a single comma between my subject and my verb unless there are two. C is asking me to put a comma between my subject and my verb phrase are not difficult. Okay? And that can never happen. D is my answer. You could have also just gone shortest is best, or ear test, like examples are not difficult to find, does not need any kind of pause. Example 2. Do I see end punctuation in my answer choices? I guess first and foremost I should ask, is there a directive? The answer is no. None of these have directives. This passage example is the actual passage. And the passage says, even the parts of a chili vary, the seeds and veins of a pepper are hotter than the flesh. Do I see end punctuation in any of these? I see but, which is a fanboy, but there's no comma. I see comma, but then no fanboy following. I see a semicolon, and I see no punctuation. Here is my end punctuation, and it's after vary, so there's where my barrier line goes. Even the parts of a chili vary. This word throws a lot of people off. If I said even the parts of a chili vary, you're gonna say, I don't know if that's complete or not. I know that I have subject, parts of a chili, and vary or change, which is my verb. But this part, I'm not sure if it makes it complete or not. So I'm not 100% sure if the first piece is complete or incomplete. The second part, the seeds and veins of a pepper are hotter than the flesh, definitely complete. And now you kind of have to gamble. Do you think that this is a complete part or not? Two thoughts cross my mind. One, yeah, I think it's complete. I think it makes sense, especially because the second part is definitely complete, and I'm pretty sure that this part is complete. But here's where else I could go with this. A, C, and D all kind of do the same thing in that they don't have end punctuation. I only have one choice that has end punctuation. That's probably the right answer. I'm going to call it complete and pick B. Why? Because that is end punctuation. End punctuation stops one sentence and begins the next. And that is why B is my answer. Okay, I'm going to have you go through and try to eliminate some answers. Try to use your barrier lines when it makes sense to use them, and work your way through the next 4 or 5 examples to finish this page off. Go ahead and pause your video, and I'll give you, well, however long you need, and then when you're done, you can hit play. Okay, hopefully you finished these 5 examples. We're going to go ahead and pick back up where we left off. You can edit, change, revise, whatever you need to do as we make our way through these next 5. After all, it happened so sudden. Like one day she was a sweet, agreeable 1-year-old, and the next she was a defiant, moody, terrible 2. I noticed this right off the bat. What is that? That's a comma fanboy, which means that this has to be a complete sentence. The next day, we can assume, the next she was a defiant, moody, terrible 2. Okay? That's a complete thought. I can't change that. I don't even need to read that anymore because it's not part of the equation on the left of this sentence. After all, it happened so sudden. Like one day she was a sweet, agreeable 1-year-old. The next, blah, 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 blah. Do I see end punctuation? Yeah, B and C both have end punctuation. So I'm going to put a barrier line after sudden or suddenly. And then what we have to be careful is when we read these parts, the first part's fine. We can read it to sudden or suddenly. The second part, though, I'm not going to start with the word like because B and C don't have the word like in them. So after all, it happened so sudden, or it happened so suddenly. Is that a complete thought? Subject, I don't know what it is necessarily, but it did happen, and it happened suddenly. That is a complete thought. One day she was a sweet, agreeable 1-year-old, and the next she was a defiant, moody, terrible 2. That part is complete as well. What has to go there is in punctuation, which means A and D can go away. Now, you could have also started, should it be sudden or should it be suddenly? After all, it happened so sudden. After all, it happened so suddenly. Hopefully this ear test does enough for you, and you can hear that it needs the ly. The reason, this is my verb, and how did it happen? It happened suddenly. That's because that is called an adverb. Adverbs end in ly. So I could have gotten rid of A and B off the bat if I wanted to, narrowed it down to C and D. C is the best answer because, not because this is a semicolon versus a colon, but because it ends in ly and this one doesn't. C is my answer for the third example. Red flag. Okay, whenever you see back to back to back commas. Right? Whenever you see back to back to back commas, 3 commas, like bang, 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 and it's not a list, that is probably not going to be the answer. I've seen it once in 7 years where it was the answer. So needless to say, it's not going to happen very often. Hikers typically find like that is choppy. I don't need choppiness. So I'm going to get rid of A off the bat. That the climb takes at least 3 hours. Okay. Do I see end punctuation? No punctuation. I see a comma. That's not a fanboy. I see a comma. That's not a fanboy. I don't have end punctuation here. So I am not picking, well, I can't pick a period, a semicolon, or a colon here because they're not an option, or comma fanboys. Okay. So this kind of goes back to our comma rules that we didn't really talk about yet. Always plug in the answer with no commas first and check it. Why? Because it's shortest and best. If you're in doubt, leave the comma out. The ACT litters this test with commas. Generally speaking, they're trying to confuse you. We don't always need all those commas. Let's start simple and see if it makes sense without pausing. Okay. Hikers typically find that the climb takes at least 3 hours. There's no reason to pause anywhere, and you can kind of see what's happening here. They're trying to create a non-essential clause around the word typically, which they do here. Hikers find that the climb takes at least 3 hours. That makes sense to read around this. The problem with A is that third comma. Hikers find that the climb takes at least 3 hours. That doesn't make sense to pause there. If it said hikers find that the climb takes at least 3 hours, then it would be good. Okay? But because of the bang, bang, bang 3 commas, the red flag, we're cautious of that. It doesn't mean it automatically goes away. I did read it. It doesn't make sense to pause. A goes away. I like what C and D are trying to do. This one has the second comma, but not the first. This one has the first, but not the second. If I pushed C and D together, it would be perfect. Unfortunately, because it's not pushed together, they both go away. No comma is the best answer for that one. The next example about the subways. Do I see end punctuation in any of my answer choices? No, no, yes, comma, fanboys. And then A in the passage, there was no punctuation. Okay, so I'm going to put my barrier line after subways. About 3.5 million people a day ride the subways. That's a complete thought. I think maybe I've met them all. That's a complete thought. I have to have end punctuation. The only one that does it is B, comma, fanboys. Not all visitors, however, have been so welcome. Years ago, an escaped convict made his way to her mountain retreat and threatened her. Do I see end punctuation? A is no end punctuation. B has a colon. C has a semicolon. D has a comma, not a fanboy. So these two have end punctuation after welcome. Barrier line. I also see this very, very short non-essential clause. Can I read around it? Not all visitors have been so welcome. Yeah, it makes definite sense. I don't need this. If it makes sense or helps you understand the sentence, then go ahead and get rid of it. Not all visitors have been so welcome. That is a complete thought. Second part. Years ago, an escaped convict made his way to her mountain retreat and threatened her. That is also complete. I am dealing with two complete pieces. Do I need the word since or not? Well, what do we know when there's no directive? When there's no directive, I'm trying for the cleanest, most concise way to say things, which would be no extra word. Does it make sense with no extra word? Years ago, an escaped convict made his way to her mountain retreat and threatened her. Yes, it does. If I used since years ago, an escaped convict made his way, like, that's redundant. Years ago already tells me since. I don't need both of those phrases. And then our last one is kind of our tough one. I see in punctuation in one spot, I believe. Yeah, it's just after kindling. The next morning using twigs for kindling. Who is doing this? She is, but she is not over here. That means that this piece is not complete. I have an incomplete piece with some punctuation. She starts a small blaze in the firebox is complete. One part is incomplete, which means I cannot use, right? Any part is incomplete. I'm going to be using commas or non-essential clauses or something along those lines. I can't use any of these things. That's why I got rid of choice C. Okay. And it looks to me, now the next thing I'm asking myself, do any of these create a non-essential clause? Well, A does. The next morning for kindling, she starts a small, that sounds kind of, the next morning for kindling, that sounds kind of funny. I've got one here. The next morning, she starts a small blaze in the firebox. I like that one. D. The next morning using twigs, she starts a small blaze in the firebox. I don't mind that. This is weird. For kindling doesn't seem like a non-essential clause, really. This kind of goes with using twigs for kindling. Like, that phrase needs to go together. And so our best answer here is B. And this is a non-essential clause question. Hopefully those are starting to make a little bit more sense to you. This is a tough question, but hopefully you could at least eliminate one or two of the ones that I got rid of. Okay. Moving on. Okay, the apostrophe rule. So I was in high school at one point in my life, and my first name is Travis. Okay, and I was trying to say, like, join us at Travis's house for a day of graduation or a day of celebration or whatever the card says that I'm trying to send out to people so I can get my money for graduation, right? And I'm not sure, should it be Travis's house or should it be Travis's house? I had no idea, like no idea. And I'm a stubborn human and also maybe kind of lazy. And so instead of like maybe going online and Googling it or going to school and asking a teacher for some help or doing anything that required any extra effort, I just said, and I didn't want to choose and be wrong, so I just said, please join us at the house of Travis for a day of celebration. And I think I probably sounded even dumber. I should have just picked one and gone with it or asked somebody. Now, what do you think the right answer is? A lot of people pick this one. The right answer is this one. It's a very simple rule why. The apostrophe, when used for possession, right, Travis's house, I own the house. I didn't, my parents did, but you get the hint. Okay? When it's a singular subject, I'm going to use apostrophe S. So a man, his shoes, the man's shoes, apostrophe S. My boss's car, boss, apostrophe S, car, because my boss owns that car. Versus plural, let's say there were several boys in my neighborhood and we all built a tree house. The boys' tree house, plural, apostrophe because they owned that tree house. Versus BOY apostrophe S, which would be like the boy's treehouse, like his treehouse in his backyard that he built by himself, or his dad probably built, right? The cats, so several cats, trash can. Maybe that all these cats live in a trash can. Cats apostrophe trash can because it's plural. Dresses, I can't come up with an example. I don't wear dresses often, sorry, but you get the picture, okay? Apostrophe because the dresses, several of them own something. Hangers or whatever, I don't know. Okay, and that's the rule. Obviously, there are exceptions. English is a fickle language. Okay, when the base of the word changes, this is singular, this is plural. You see the spelling changes from man to men. One man, several men. Okay, if the man owns something, it becomes man's. But if men, I made it plural, I didn't add an S like I did here. Boy to boys, cat to cats, dress to dresses. I didn't just add S or ES, I changed the base spelling of the word. When I do that, I'm always going to use apostrophe S at the end. Man became men. When men own something, it becomes men apostrophe S. Here's the simple way to remember that. Is that a word? No, because men is already plural, so the apostrophe has to go there. Okay, same thing with child. Child becomes children. Children gets apostrophe S because the base word is already plural. Person becomes people. People gets apostrophe S because people is already plural. Peoples, that's not a word, right? I'd have to put the apostrophe there. Okay, and so that's our simplistic rule with apostrophes, and we've got some practice that we can do with this here in a minute. The other way we can use an apostrophe is with contractions. Remember, contractions are just like two words that are pushed together that form one. Some examples: it is, or who is, or they are, or we are becomes there and were, or we're, and its and whose. Right, those are contractions. ITS is a possessive, like his and hers. So if I had a dog, I do, and its collar was cute, but I didn't know if it was a boy or a girl, I would just say its collar or its haircut. All right, it's a pronoun that stands for Mowgli or Bagheera, my dog's names. Okay, if I used the actual name like Joel and Heather, Joel's hair or Heather's jacket, right? I'm using an apostrophe because those are proper nouns. Okay, but if I said his jacket or her haircut, I wouldn't be using apostrophes because these are pronouns. Same with its. This word does not get an apostrophe unless it's a contraction and I'm breaking it into it is. It is his. It is getting cold outside. And this is important. That pronoun ITS apostrophe, you're going to see it a lot on the ACT. They're going to try and trick you. It's never a word. That is not a word. Be very careful of that. When you see it, cross off the answer. ITS apostrophe means nothing. You don't have ownership, and it's not it is. You're not breaking that apart, so it's not a word. Same rule here applies. Whose versus whose. Whose is a possessive. Whose car are we taking? I couldn't say who is car are we taking. That wouldn't make any sense. But this one is a contraction. That apostrophe, I break the word apart. Who is? Who is driving tonight? Right? Who's driving tonight? Who is driving tonight? Whose car are we taking? Who is car doesn't make sense. So that's the difference between these two words. Okay, a little trial and error. Okay, and I often work backwards on these. The first thing I ask myself, like I look at the question, what is this question about? Do I see end punctuation? No. Do I see non-essential clauses? No. But I do see apostrophes scattered everywhere, right? So I'm looking at last first. Do the houses own anything? Well, the sentence ends, so we can assume no. So I'm getting rid of these two. Do the villagers own anything? Yeah, they own the houses, right? So I have to use an apostrophe because it's a possessive. And the only answer here is A. I didn't know off the bat. This is kind of ambiguous. I didn't know if it was one villager with lots of houses or lots of villagers with lots of houses. But they didn't make me pick between apostrophe S and S apostrophe because it was kind of confusing or unclear. So they're not going to make me pick when it is confusing or unclear. Okay? So villagers, they own the houses. It's several of them apparently. Our second example, is that a word? No, I would change that Y to IES, so I can get rid of A. Is C a word? No, so I can get rid of C. Does humanity own something? The blueprint can be used to trace humanity's maternal tree. Who does this maternal tree belong to? Humanity. I need ownership. B is my answer. If you flip back 2 pages, there is some apostrophe work right here. I'm going to walk through these first 3 with you, and then I'm going to let you practice with the rest of it. Okay, so no directive, no end punctuation, no non-essential clauses. What else is happening? Well, I see all these apostrophes, and duh, that's what this whole thing is going to be working on. But I wanted to show you kind of my thought process if it were an actual ACT question, in not pulled out of context. Okay, so the first thing I'm doing, do the arms own anything? No. Do the pitchers own anything? Well, who do these arms belong to? The pitchers. I need an apostrophe there. D is the only one. Why is it S apostrophe? Both pitchers' arms, right? That's why it's not apostrophe S, because it's not singular, it's plural. It has to be S apostrophe. D is my answer. 2, we're going to learn about something called an antecedent. And it's just what a pronoun refers to. Like the actual noun. So an antecedent is what a pronoun like refers back to, or the actual noun that it stands for. Okay, and so that'll make sense here in a second. The next restaurant we visited was Casey's, known for its atmosphere, its cuisine, and the mix of celebrities it attracts. Okay. The first thing that we're going to do here is look at these. So I'm seeing some commas, but I'm noticing like it's a list, so it's not non-essential clauses. There's no end punctuation. I do see like some apostrophes going on, right? And then the pronouns are changing too. It versus their. We'll start with the apostrophes. This is the way I always read it. I always read this as it is because it's a contraction. Known for it is atmosphere, it is cuisine. That doesn't make sense, right? It is, if that was apostrophe S, wouldn't make sense. So I can get rid of H. It is atmosphere and it is cuisine. And F, because of that one, those are the 2 that I can get rid of. It's atmosphere, it's cuisine. That makes sense. Their atmosphere, their cuisine. That makes sense. The difference here, plural, singular. Well, what are we talking about? What is this referring back to? That's a pronoun. What does it refer back to? A restaurant. Is that restaurant singular or plural? Well, it's singular because it doesn't say S, right? The next restaurant we visited was Casey's. It's one place. It is singular. There is plural. J is my answer. 3, and I think I've actually accidentally got the right answer crossed out here. Do the ideas own anything? No. So I'm probably going to get rid of C and D. Who owns the ideas? Well, we do, or one another. I guess it's kind of a weird one, but this group of people own it. one person, one another's ideas, and B is my correct answer. Okay. Go through this and play with it a little bit. I'm going to have you we'll do 4, 5, 7, 10. So that's 4, 5, 7, 10, 11, 12, 13, 15, and 16. 11, 12, 13, 15, and 16. And go through and do those problems. Take 5 or 10 minutes to do it. Go ahead and hit pause at this point in time, and then when you're done, unpause it, and I will tell you the answers. Go ahead and pause. Okay. Hopefully you got through some of these. I'm sure you've got some questions. These things can get kind of tricky. Does humanity own anything? This is a hard one, kind of. Who is willing? Humanity is. So humanity owns this willingness. That's kind of a weird one. So I'm going to get rid of those two. Is it one humanity or several humanities? It's one humanity. Where's F? I'm not too worried about that one. That one's kind of a tricky one. 5. Is this ever a word? No. Who are we referring to? Listening to the orchestra, one can appreciate their virtuosity. We're talking about, that's the antecedent, the orchestra. It's singular. It can't be there. One can appreciate it is virtuosity or its virtuosity. It's not it is, it's be its. 7, I skipped this one because it's just kind of a weird one if you did it. Africa's one place, not several. Do the artisans or artists own anything? No, that's just plural. So my answer there was H. If you didn't do it, it's not a big deal. 7. Okay, so is it is or it's? It is actually losing it is population. It's actually losing its population. It's harder to say. When you don't break it apart, it's harder to hear. It is actually losing it is population. This one makes sense to break apart. This one doesn't. It is actually losing its population. 10. Okay, it is. All right, so I know that that's not a word. So F can go away. If I want to work backwards, I can. Who owns the bloodlines? The parents. The puppy apparently benefited from its parents' bloodlines. Well, how many parents does it have? Several parents. There is definitely ownership. So those two could go away. Right? And that's why it is parents wouldn't have made sense anyway. Okay. So is it multiple parents or is it one parent? It would have benefited from its parents' bloodlines, plural. This needs to be plural too. J is my answer. 11. This one's kind of tricky. What is the singular version? I've got one ox and then several oxen. You may not have known that, and that's okay. Let's try to work backwards. Do the virtues own anything? No. That goes away. Is that a word? No. Is there ownership? Yeah. B is my answer. And that's because it's already plural, and that's why it gets apostrophe S. So that's a tough one. It should have probably been between B and C. 12. A chef who is meals? That doesn't make sense. Do the meals own anything? No, it's just several of them, right? A chef whose meals, plural. J is my answer. 13. I've got a non-essential clause here. Julia Child popularized French cooking in America. Julia Child. So I need the comma. Maybe you started there. You probably didn't. You probably started with the apostrophes. That's fine too. Who is known as the French chef or who's known as the French chef? Well, it's who is. 15. If you are not careful, you will hurt their feelings. Well, that last part doesn't make any sense. Do the feelings own anything? No. And 16. The movers failed to budge the piano as it is sturdy. It doesn't make any sense. As it is did not make sense. The movers failed to budge the piano since its sturdy legs remained wedged, and G is my answer. Okay, and that's how we do those apostrophe questions. You're going to get some more practice with that in passage, but that's how the apostrophes work. Go ahead and flip back a couple of pages. We're going to pick up kind of where we left off in here in our notes. This is page 20. We just talked about the apostrophes. We can just do a quick refresher. Remember, if it's possession and it's singular, we're going to add apostrophe S. If it's plural, we're going to add S apostrophe. Exceptions, when the base word changes, we're always going to use apostrophe S at the end. And then the other side of those apostrophes are the contractions. And what are we doing with those? Always breaking them apart. Okay? The fourth thing, and we're going to move through these pretty quickly. I versus me. I is the subject, me is the object of a sentence. In compound usage, we're going to throw out the other person. What that means is just get rid of, like, this guy. Me went fishing last summer. Well, that doesn't make any sense, right? No, that needs to be I. Robert and I went fishing last summer. If you get rid of that other person, it's normally going to help you figure out if it sounds right or not. Okay? And that's a pretty simplistic rule, but I guarantee you I can trip you up with this. And we're going to do that example here in a second. Before we do that, I wanted to talk about I versus me again, just a little bit clearer and more. Subject, so English is written like this. Subject, verb, object order. Subject almost always comes first, then the verb, and then the object. Okay? I is the subject. Well, where does the subject come? At the beginning of almost all sentences. Where's the object? The end of most sentences. Me is almost always at the end of a sentence. I is almost always at the beginning of a sentence. Okay? If you get rid of the other person, the sentence will kind of clear itself up for you. But listen to this one. Later this week, after the games are over, would you like to go see a movie with my sister and blank? Okay, first and foremost, I see this. That's a non-essential clause, right? Later this week, would you like to go see a movie with my sister and blank? Would you like to go see a movie with my sister and I? Would you like to go see a movie with my sister and me? What sounds better? A lot of people will say I does, with my sister and I, because a lot of people talk incorrectly, and that is one that's hard to use our ear because so many people say this incorrectly. Would you like to go see a movie with me? Get rid of the other person. Would you like to go see a movie with me? Would you like to go see a movie with I? Then it's clear that it should be me. And the reason is that this is the object, and the object is at the end of the sentence, so it should be me. Okay. If I said my sister and I are going to a movie, would you like to come? I am going to a movie, would you like to come? Or me am going to a movie. Then when I move it to the front, it makes sense to use I. Okay? Who versus whom? So this is actually a simpler rule than a lot of people give it credit for, but it is really tough to explain, so we're just going to jump right into the examples. A friend to me is a person who can tell the truth. Okay, so here's the option. Should it be who or should it be whom? Well, the rule is this. Less letters equals less parts. And those parts that we're talking about are subject and verb. Less letters is the difference between who and whom. Well, which one has more letters? Whom does. So it gets more parts. It gets both parts. Who has less letters, less parts. It's only going to have verb. Who only gets verb. Whom gets both. More parts, more letters. Less parts, less letters. That'll make sense with an example. So here's my option. What follows it? Can tell. Is there a subject? There is not. This is just a verb. Less letters, less parts. I don't know whom he gave the book to. Subject, verb. More parts, more letters. More parts, more letters. Try your 2. Our first one, what comes after? Just a verb. Less parts, less letters. Our second one, more parts, more letters. Hopefully that rule makes a little bit of sense. It's not the end of the world if it doesn't. There's only like 1 or 2 questions on any ACT about who and whom anyway, so it kind of is what it is. Prepositional phrases, we're not going to spend a ton of time with this. So here's kind of what we can do with this. We're going to draw this terrible tree, lordy, and this butterfly. Right, this butterfly can be in the tree, on the tree, under the tree. It can go around the tree, right? Any of these words, through the tree, above the tree, beyond the tree. It could be the man or the butterfly of the tree. It could be a butterfly with a tree, right? Those words that we're using to relate these 2 nouns are called prepositional phrases, or prepositions that create a prepositional phrase. Our basic rules with these, we're going to treat them like non-essential clauses, like non-essential clauses. We're going to bracket them. We're going to read around them. The thing here with this one is that they don't get commas, and sometimes they will. It just depends on the sentence, but normally they're not going to get commas because they're like the poor man's non-essential clause. They're a poor man's non-essential clause. They do the same thing. They give us extra information to relate the 2 nouns or subjects, but they just don't get commas normally like a non-essential clause would. Okay, so we're going to bracket it. We're going to read around it. The subject can never be in the prepositional phrase, and that's the part that kind of gets tricky. So, and here's an example. The group of settlers blank through the forest. Which one do you think it is? Take a second. Okay, what is my subject? Who am I talking about? And this is where people will really struggle. Almost everyone is going to say that this is my subject. This is actually not the subject, because that is a preposition. This is a subject or a noun, and this is a noun. How am I relating those 2 things? With a prepositional phrase. Okay, this is my subject, and it's singular. The group wanders through the forest. If I said settlers, if I read this as settlers wander through the forest, or wandered through the forest, right? It changes depending on the subject. So I've got to make sure that I get the right subject. This is the prepositional phrase, and I have to stay away from that as my subject. Okay? Always identify the subject, and this is just an extension. Subject-verb agreement is really just an extension of prepositional phrases. We've got to be careful when there are prepositional phrases. So what is my subject in this sentence? This combination of words blank from the Anglo-Saxon influence. What is my subject? Is it words, or is it combination? Well, that's a prep phrase. We have to be careful. This combination come, or this combination comes. Words come, or words comes, right? We've got to be careful because it's opposite. We're plugging in A with one of them and B with the other. But this is the subject that we need. This combination comes from the Anglo-Saxon influence. Right. Our last little bit here. Okay, we've talked about commas a little bit. We're going to talk about them in depth a little bit more. We've talked about before fanboys to link complete ideas. This is just from the chart that we talked about earlier. And actually, if we wanted to redraw that again, that's what goes in the box on this one is comma fanboys, complete, comma fanboys, complete. In between a complete idea and an incomplete idea in either order, this is kind of a tricky one. We're not going to get too in-depth with this, but if you see the word which in the middle of a sentence, we always have to use a comma before it. Okay? That's going to take care of maybe half of those situations, but that's a good rule to know. Anytime you see which in the middle of a sentence, it has to have a comma before it. This one's important, and it's something we've talked about. 3 is very important. This is new. If I have an intro phrase, I have to put a comma before the subject. Okay? If my subject does not start the sentence, if there's anything before the subject, I have to offset it with this comma most of the time. This is a pretty good rule to follow. Okay, so introductory phrase, comma, what has to come next is the subject. 4, after every item in a list, this is called the Oxford comma. Okay, some people use it. It's like something that looks like this. If I had a list of things, I have to use that last comma. Milk, cheese, and bread. That's what I went to the store to get. Milk, comma, cheese, comma, and bread. That last comma is called the Oxford comma. You have to use it on the ACT. Between a list of 2 things. So this is, I don't like the word things. We're going to change that to adjectives or descriptive words. And we'll see an example of that here in a minute. And then 6 is a really important one as well. And we've talked about it a ton. Before and after unnecessary information. Well, what's another term for that? Hopefully you're saying non-essential clauses, right? Before and after unnecessary information. So these are the commas that we're talking about with 6. We've talked about 1 and 6 in great detail. 3 is new. 2, 4, and 5 are not as important. How this works, and then we're going to do 4 or 5 of these together. So the process, if this was actually in the ACT, I'd ask myself, is there a directive? The answer is no. The next thing I'd ask myself, is there end punctuation? The answer is no. What is happening? What am I looking at changing with all of these answers? And it looks like it's a comma question. So the next thing I'm asking myself, is there a non-essential clause being created? Well, there is around Sam, and that looks like the only one. So I'm going to put brackets around Sam, and I'm going to read it. Our letter carrier is always cheerful. Does that make sense? Yeah, it does. So I'm going to leave that one alone. The only other, and you can see how C is giving you the first comma and not the second. D is giving you the second but not the first. Those 2 things combined equal B, but I'm not going to do them because they're not giving me the other comma. And then A, our letter carrier Sam is always cheerful. That sounds fine, but they give me the non-essential clause, and so I want to use it. My answer is B. And what rule? I'm using non-essential clauses. Rule 6. Number 2, no directive, no end punctuation, non-essential clauses. So this can get kind of confusing. This comma and this comma could create a non-essential clause, and you could try to read around it if you wanted. Oddly, less about their appearance, that doesn't make any sense. What's happening here is that this is the subject. This is an introductory idea. Intro idea, comma, subject, verb. Right? So this comma is not going to be treated as a non-essential clause. I'm going to start with the one without commas. Oddly, people care less about their appearance than they used to. I don't need to pause anywhere. J is my answer. I did not use commas. And when I don't, I just added rule 0, no commas. When I don't use a comma, I'm just going to call it rule 0. 3. Okay, so initially I see there's a non-essential clause right there, probably. the rules govern how to proceed. I read around it, and it made sense. And that is my answer. And why? I used a non-essential clause, Rule 6. And this is the last one we'll look at together. Candidate Miel Yi is running for class president on a platform promising her classmates the best prom ever. Okay, red flag. Ding, ding, ding. I got 3 commas in a row. It doesn't make any sense to do that, especially if I tried to read it. Candidate Miel Yi is running for class president. It doesn't make sense. Do I have a non-essential clause? G does it. And I'll read around her name. Candidate is running for class president. Well, that doesn't make any sense because my subject is actually Miel Yi. If it said a candidate or the candidate, then candidate would be my subject.